Gaza is once again in flames. Airstrikes intensify, casualties rise, and diplomatic statements pile up, yet nothing changes. The United Nations warns of a worsening humanitarian catastrophe, while Israel continues its military operations unfazed by global condemnation. The international community calls for de-escalation, but its influence remains limited. Europe condemns the violence, but avoids real pressure. The ICC and ICJ issued decisions regarding the situation in Palestine, yet accountability is nowhere in sight. With legal mechanisms failing and humanitarian aid blocked, the question remains, can the world enforce international law, or is Israel's impunity untouchable? I'm Hani Saif, and this is Think Tank.
السلام عليكم. أنا كده تمام. ألو. أنا كده موجود معايا.
The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights, in a report published by the OHCHR, warns of a mass ethnic cleansing campaign in the West Bank and an irreversible humanitarian disaster in Gaza. Over 1.9 million Palestinians have been displaced, and essential infrastructure is collapsing under relentless bombardment. Despite the ICJ rulings declaring Israel's occupation illegal and ICC arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, enforcement is absent. The United States has sanctioned the ICC, undermining its legitimacy, while European powers balance condemnation with continued trade relations. Arab and European states have backed a $53 billion reconstruction plan, but with ongoing destruction, the efforts seemed premature. The UN RWA warns that Gaza's medical system is at breaking point, while the Red Cross highlights an imminent famine. The Hague Group is pushing for sanctions, but without the backing of major powers, their efforts seem symbolic. With Israel's military campaign escalating and global responses fractured, is international intervention possible, or will another ceasefire collapse into more bloodshed? As Israel's assault on Gaza intensifies, the world faces a choice: act or enable more bloodshed. While condemnation grows, concrete actions remain absent. Will the cycle of violence and impunity continue?
Following Israel's renewed aggression against Gaza, the international community faces a critical juncture. The Arab states, despite emergency summits, grapple with translating diplomatic condemnation into effective action. The United Nations, while expressing deep concern over the humanitarian catastrophe, faces limitations in enforcing international law. The UNRWA urgently calls for a restored ceasefire, highlighting the dire conditions and overwhelmed medical facilities, as reported by the Red Cross, and the destruction of critical infrastructure, including water resources. The Palestinian resistance, while enduring significant losses, demonstrates resilience. The question remains whether they sufficiently reorganize to launch substantial counter-operations. Israel's calculated ceasefire, viewed as a tactical pause, aimed to regroup and maximize its military advantage, as evidenced by subsequent intensification of strikes. The possibility of a durable ceasefire hinges on enforcing accountability for Israeli violations, a task the international community has historically failed to achieve. The The statements from Egypt's Foreign Ministry, the Palestinian Presidency, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Irish Foreign Minister all converge on the urgent need to halt Israeli aggression and protect Palestinian civilians. Turkey has vocally condemned the attacks, urging global action, with UAE issuing strong condemnations. There is an escalating death toll and immense suffering. The core issue remains the international community's capacity to move beyond rhetoric and implement concrete measures to enforce international law and protect Palestinian lives. The failure to do so perpetuates a cycle of violence and impunity.
Now, to explore the international response to Israel's actions and whether accountability can truly be enforced, we welcome our guest, Dr. Mohammed Osman, the International Affairs Specialist, and Mr. Ibrahim al-Darawi, the writer and political analyst. Gentlemen, welcome to Think Tank. Dr. Osman, with the recent escalation in Gaza and the ongoing expansion of settlements in the West Bank, Israel continues to violate international law and enforcement remains non-existent. So why does Israel continue to act with impunity?
Thank you for having me, Hani. Greetings to you and your audience and your guest. Of course, as you just said, Israel continues to act with absolute impunity, feeling absolutely no accountability. And what ensures Israel's continued impunity, of course, is the enablement of the United States through unconditional support and through providing unlimited political cover to Israel in international organizations, namely, of course, the United Nations, and specifically the United Nations Security Council, blocking any resolutions that might condemn Israel, let alone impose any punitive actions against it on account of its continued and incessant violations on a rather systemic manner of international law. And of course, Israel has over the past 16 months violated international humanitarian law and international human rights law with absolute impunity in a rather brazen fashion. The latest manifestation of violence and genocidal behavior in Gaza over the past 24 hours is a testament to that. Over 430 people, primarily civilians, were massacred within a few hours of the reigniting of hostilities in Gaza, targeting of refugee tent cities, the targeting of what remains of medical facilities inside the Gaza Strip, targeting areas of food supplies and essentials and humanitarian aid hubs, while depriving the Gaza Strip for the past 17 days from the entry of humanitarian aid. This is a textbook case of genocide, and also these are crimes against humanity and war crimes. Yet Israel will remain immune to any accountability, as we just said, due to the unlimited US political cover and the unlimited US support for Israel's actions that even reaches the degree of collusion, if you know what I mean, Hani.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Darawi, now we've witnessed the ICC and the ICJ issuing decisions, including the recent arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, yet without any enforcement. So are these legal mechanisms just symbolic gestures, just merely for public consumption?
I think that the international body expressed a full condemnation of the latest Israeli escalation that reached the officials of the United Nations stated that in a blatant violation of the international law, and also threaten the efforts of peace in the Middle East. But unfortunately, following these statements, we haven't seen any response from the Israeli actions, and we should directed this to U.S. American administration that gave the green light to Israel. And why up till this now that Donald Trump hasn't given yet a green light for the land invasion? And due to that, Israel never listened to the Arab vision to manage this file, but listen to Netanyahu that the pressure on Hamas that would lead to the release of the hostages. Notably speaking, throughout the 15 months of the war in Gaza, the Israeli actions failed to release the hostages. So why they return back again? And by saying Trump is also expressed his expression that this war wouldn't have come to a beginning if he was in the office. Why should we go back to the unilateral Israeli vision? I think there is something is planned, which is the voluntary or forced displacement of the Palestinians. Israel had failed of the forced displacement due to the Egypt and Jordan's stances of rejections along with some Western countries, and the other thing is that the Israeli government started the process of the voluntary displacement of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians have already rejected and never surrendered to this vision. Throughout the occupied the Palestinian territories, specifically since through the path Ben Gurion, for the Palestinians who wish to flee from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, and I think this time will be with no return, and I think with the assistance of the US, the Israeli government is doing this plan based on the ultimate goal of Netanyahu, and now is returning Ben Gvir to his cabinet once again. Yet, the Israeli within Israel has a great dilemma due to the latest escalation of airstrikes that led to the death of the one or two of the hostages. So Netanyahu is having another dilemma due to what's happening to the Israeli hostages and the increase of the martyrs we've seen yesterday. And that made, and I think the international community today, along the Geneva Conventions of second article, along with the other Western countries, should take in real and decisive resolutions for the ceasefire. And I think that through the League of Arab States, the Arab leaders have already proposed a practical solution that the Western side should listen to.
Dr. Osman, we've seen economic sanctions being used against other nations for far lesser violations. So why haven't Western states considered serious economic pressure against Israel? Why do Western states seem quite toothless?
The short answer to your question, Hani, is they would not dare, because the United States would never allow it. And from what we have heard over the past 16 months, some European countries and some Western states were very vocal about the Israeli violations in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories in general. And while that is commendable, it's nearly not enough. It's basically paying lip service to the dire humanitarian situation of the Palestinian people without taking any concrete actions. Not a single European country has imposed serious sanctions on the state of Israel, Belgium or Spain or even Ireland or the Netherlands or any of the countries that have criticized Israel's conduct or how Israel has conducted itself in Gaza, for example, and in the West Bank, they have not moved a single finger in order to sanction Israel or hold it accountable. While, for example, on the complete opposite, countries like Iran, countries like Russia, countries like Syria, before the fall of the Assad regime, Venezuela, many of these countries have been subjected to sanctions, or rather unilateral sanctions in many cases that are not even legal. Why? Because these countries are not allies of the United States and the West. If you are not an ally, then of course you will be subjected to sanctions and punitive punishment. Then if you violate the law, that's a big if, you will always be punished on account of that. However, if you are an ally of the West, if you are part of the West and your name is Israel, then of course you can enjoy complete immunity from any accountability, unfortunately. And this is what we are seeing in the case of Gaza. No one is trying to impose economic sanctions because actually economic sanctions, if they were imposed, for example, by many countries around the world on Israel, this might have yielded some results because it would have isolated Israel economically, and it might have pressured them into indulge, at least accepting a ceasefire. As you have seen over the past 57 days, Israel was coaxed into a ceasefire deal by the Trump administration. However, they hardly abided by the first phase, and of course, they violated many of the provisions of the first phase of the ceasefire, yet it was successfully accomplished, and then they refused to enter into the second phase. They refused even to enter into serious negotiations about the second phase, and the Americans enabled their attempts to evade their obligations in this regard by providing Steve Witkoff's proposals of these alternative solutions and temporary solutions in order to prolong the ceasefire and secure the release of more detainees, while not giving any assurances that the conflict will end or that this will be a definitive cessation of hostilities. And of course, Israel at the end of the day was so angered by the Palestinian resistance not adhering or not agreeing to it, not agreeing to the terms of the ceasefire everyone agreed upon, which was basically mediated by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. So they were so angered by that, they decided to go back into war and go on a brutal rampage and kill hundreds of civilians once again, in order to try to exact these concessions out of the Palestinian resistance by the force of arms. And what we have seen from the response from the Western nations is embarrassing, to say the least. It is shameful that they have not taken any action so far. This genocide has been going on for over 16 months. At least 60,000 people have already perished in this war, if not even more. Some figures go estimate that double that number has actually died as a result of the Israeli aggression, whether directly or indirectly, yet the world does not move an inch. And why? That's because the United States will not allow any decisive action to be taken against Israel. However, if this persists, this will never buy the United States any credibility or security, neither will it buy Israel any long-term security. If anything, this endless vortex of violence and bloodshed and conflict will, at the end of the day, harm U.S. interests and will jeopardize Israeli security on the long term, if not the medium.
Well, Mr. Darawi, the Hague Group has emerged as a bloc trying to push for stronger action. But without major global powers backing them, can they realistically make an impact? Is that a slim glimmer of hope? Mr. Darawi, can you hear me, sir? We seem to be having some technical difficulties with Mr. Darawi. I'll go back to you, Dr. Osman, now. The international pressure mounting. Could diplomatic isolation somehow force Israel to alter its approach, or does military superiority render the external influence meaningless, really?
Well, that's a very good question, Hani. Will diplomatic isolation work? Of course it will. Does it exist? No, it doesn't. There is no diplomatic isolation of Israel, unfortunately. No country has taken any strong measures. No country that matters, actually, in the international community has taken any strong measures against Israel in order to pressure it to give concessions with regards to adhering to a ceasefire and ending the conflict in Gaza and agreeing to a definitive resolution of the current phase of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is not materializing on the ground because no one is taking any action against Israel. Beyond the press releases and the official statements of condemnation and outrage over Israel's action, no one is really doing anything, with the exception, of course, with countries like the Hague Group, like you mentioned, with South Africa's movement, moves at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in order to hold Israel accountable on account of its violations of the Genocide Convention. However, the major economic and industrial powers of the world are not taking any action. And I will not even mention the Europeans and the Americans. Okay, those are allies of the West. We have countries like China and Russia and India, countries from the global South, countries that have been historically on the side of the Palestinian cause, who refuse to take any concrete action to punish Israel or to hold it accountable. A country like China, for example, which has a huge economic relationship with Israel, even though they condemn Israel all the time and they deplore their behavior and they support Palestine in the United Nations and in other international platforms, yet they do not take any action, for example, in order to economically pressure Israel. The same goes for a country like India, even though now the right-wing government of Narendra Modi in India is much more sympathetic to Israel. And this, of course, is in complete contrast to the historical support India has provided to the Palestinian cause. And also, a country like Russia, for example, is in the same predicament. So I will not only blame the West for that, Hani. The problem is Israel is not suffering from any diplomatic isolation, even though its relationship is strained with the Arab countries and with many countries in the global South. This is not enough in order to pressure Israel or to let us make the assessment that it is diplomatically isolated.
Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we got Mr. Darawi back online now. Sir, the Hague Group has emerged as a bloc pushing for stronger action. Do you think that they can realistically have some sort of an impact, even though major global powers are not backing them? Do you think the United Nations might suggest a peacekeeping force on the ground? Is there any sort of real international hope?
I think that the United Nations has nothing on the ground. Whoever is having the resolution of war and peace is the Israeli government backed by the United States. I think on the ground, international organizations and the United Nations do not imply the international laws upon Israel, as we see, using the veto coming from the United States before any condemnation to Israel. We have nothing or no condemnations by the international court. And that since even 1948, therefore, things are going in the past for the Israelis to do whatever they like against the Palestinians, and therefore we need to reinstate the United or the international community to the laws they've already issued.
Yes. Well, Dr. Osman, I'll go back to you now. One final question, because we have less than a minute. With the ICC and the ICJ making the decisions not yet being implemented, also The Hague might not be as dependable and impactful as they wish. Now, looking ahead, what are the legal, diplomatic avenues left for the Palestinians to pursue justice and accountability?
In a nutshell, Hani, to be very honest, none. Because I think all of the avenues have been exhausted. International courts have been exhausted. The ICJ's measures that have been ordered, the temporary measures, have been completely ignored by Israel and opposed by the United States. The U.S. is contemplating an Israel withdrawal from the ICJ. The ICC is subjected to U.S. sanctions and U.S. isolation. The judges and the prosecutor of the ICC are subjected to unilateral U.S. sanctions. So these institutions now are fighting their own battle for survival and continued relevance, unfortunately. So all of these avenues have been exhausted, and the Security Council, of course, remains blocked due to the United States veto, which prevents any accountability for Israel.
Dr. Mohammed Osman and Mr. Ibrahim Al-Darawi, gentlemen, thank you very much for your insights. The crisis in Gaza is not just a humanitarian catastrophe. It's a test of the international system's ability to uphold its own principles. Legal rulings exist, yet enforcement is absent. Diplomatic condemnation is widespread, yet actions remain elusive. The international community faces a defining moment, one where words must be met with action if justice is ever to be realized. The world watches, debates, and condemns, but will it act? Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this episode of Think Tank. I'm Henny Saif. Thank you for joining us.